is already the 10th NAEIC Seminar. So it's beginning to be a real tradition. And today we have with us our very own Tana Joseph. So thank you very much, Tana, for volunteering to give this talk. Tana is from South Africa, as probably by now many of you know, and she's an expert in social justice and equity, inclusion and diversity, and that's why she is now our diversity officer for all of Dutch astronomy. But of course, Tana is also an astronomer working on X-ray binaries, and she has that expertise as well. So she knows our world in many ways, and she brings an extra kind of expertise to it. And today, Tana is going to talk to us about decolonization, which is a very important topic, both because it really is important, but also because it often seems in discussions to create somewhat strong feelings and misunderstandings. And so Tana has volunteered to give us some basic education about it. So thank you very much, Tana. Welcome, and please take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today and for the opportunity to speak. So I'm going to be giving a talk that I've slightly updated, but is mostly based on a talk that Professor Pedro Russo at Leiden and I presented at a decolonization symposium at the university in Leiden. And we were the only scientists there. Everyone else was from social science, and they had a lot to say, and they are much more further along in these conversations and doing the work and so on. But they were very excited to see some scientists participating. And so this is kind of just what we covered. We didn't have a lot of time, so I tried to flesh it out more for this talk. But there should be a lot of time at the end for discussion. So I will start sharing my screen. And I can start. So so the title is Perspectives on Decolonizing Astronomy. And as I said, this is a presentation that I created and presented with Pedro Russo at Leiden, and then also some additional research by Tiamiso Makwela, who is a PhD student in Cape Town in South Africa. And she kindly gave us some materials as well towards this talk. So I want to start this talk the same way I start my EDI talks and the one that you've heard me give in the seminar series as well, by stating that if we are really committed to creating a diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just society, we must first be prepared to reflect on, have conversations about, and engage with things that make us uncomfortable. So as Ralph already said in the introduction, talking about social justice makes people uncomfortable. It makes you have to really think about yourself and your place in the world and how you got there. And as a person and as a member of a community or a citizen in a country, and that is often quite challenging for all of us because, there are things about how society works that affect all of us negatively and positively, and having to be faced with the fact that, sometimes you just got really lucky or you have some kind of privilege makes people uncomfortable. And especially when you are grappling with things like, it's one thing to kind of be dealing with the issues that we're facing now in the world, but when you try and take a step back and take a historical look at how things got to be the way they were, or when things were set up so that we ended up in a situation that makes it even more difficult because people want to distance themselves and say, well, that was 400 years ago, and I'm not to blame for something that people did 400 years ago. And we need to be prepared to interrogate that and investigate that and actually think about how things came about and how we are living our lives now, to either change the way things are for the better or continue to take an easy road and ignore things. So as I also often do in my talks, I start with definitions of things, because a lot of times people, when they get in these uncomfortable situations, they want to argue semantics, and it helps to save time and to just kind of have the definitions upfront to prevent those kinds of arguments that don't really go anywhere. So decolonization, in its traditional understanding, or is this process or this action of a state withdrawing from a former colony, so a country or piece of land, not their own, that they, that they went to, invaded, etc., and leaving it as an independent country. So South Africa became independent, an independent republic in the 60s. We were, of course, so at the time we were a British colony, but we were, of course, also the time before that, Dutch colony, which is why I speak English and Afrikaans. And another way to think about decolonization is restorative justice through cultural, psychological, and economic freedom. So that economic part is obviously tremendously important. Again, I know I use this example of South Africa a lot, but it's obviously the one I know the best. And so this idea, for instance, of climate justice and how rich countries benefited by destroying our earth and plundering natural resources, especially in Africa, and causing, global warming, because you had your industrial revolutions. And now when other countries want to come forward and say, well, we also want to do that. And I was like, no, you have to use solar power to do that, because it's going to destroy the environment. So so there's that, power imbalance and things that happened long ago, but that are affecting us now, and how that impacts certain countries' ability to enrich themselves, because avenues are being closed to us now, and we're being told that that's the wrong way to do it, but you could do it for 300 years and it was fine. Another way to think of it in the context of decolonization, in the context of academia, is this beautiful quote from a 4th-year student at the University of Cape Town. This was their honors thesis, that I quote this from. Decolonization in academia goes simply beyond racial redress and aims to connect the center of knowledge production with the society it produces this knowledge for. So that's more relevant to us in this context here. So it's not just about hiring more Black people or getting more girls and women in STEM or whatever. It's about thinking about where knowledge comes from, who has access to it, and that thing about where knowledge comes from is so very important, because there's this idea that knowledge comes from a certain group of people and everyone else has to just learn about it. And that's not necessarily even a race thing or a country thing, but even a science thing, because, a lot of scientists believe that we are the keepers of knowledge, and we are in charge of who gets to know these things and how they get to know it and what context they get to know it in. And at the end of this talk, there's an example about this as well that should make things clearer. So the next question then is, why should we decolonize astronomy in particular? And that comes back to, this is obviously very closely linked to the equity, diversity, and inclusion work that I do. There's a massive overlap with decolonization and EDI work, which all falls under the umbrella along with things like climate justice, under the umbrella of social justice. So acknowledging, addressing, and undoing the colonial structures, processes, cultural practices, and mindsets within astronomy, and thereby making science more accessible, equitable, inclusive, and just for all of society. So the rest of this talk is basically going to be going through, we've identified 6 main areas where colonial structures, processes, cultural practices, and mindsets within astronomy are present, and they're quite big, broad categories. So I will say also now not exhaustive. I'm sure that in the discussion after this, people can come up with other very broad categories that perhaps weren't covered in this talk, and I'd be happy, of course, to hear about those as well. So the first thing that the first category of these broad things, the categories that we talked about, is observatories, where the observatories are placed, of course. So the major astronomy experiments often are built on indigenous lands. So in Hawaii, in South Africa, in Chile, the Canary Islands, Australia, of course. And right now, we know that there's a lot of objection to the TMT being built in Hawaii, and a lot of astronomers have shown themselves to be very dismissive of the concerns of indigenous people who have watched, their land and their sacred land in a lot of cases be used without their consultation, without receiving any reparations or, any kind of benefit. And that was very difficult to see play out across social media, where a lot of scientists were just like, these indigenous people are dumb, we should just build this telescope anyway. Very hurtful to see that play out, and people that have, that are respected in our field that are saying these things. So, which is the second point, overlooking objections by and excluding indigenous and local communities. And when I circulate this, or when this goes up on the website, these are all links, everything that underlined is links, so you can read up more about these particular issues as well. So some of these observatories and organizations still exist as colonial structures in now independent countries. And a classic example is the South Africa Astronomical Observatory in Cape Town, which celebrated its 200-year anniversary. It's so hard to know with a pandemic what time is, either last year or the year before. I think it was last year. So it's just over 200 years old now. And it was established by the British as an observatory, but for the most part, it was for navigational purposes, so that they could further their colonial efforts around the world. And the South African Astronomical Observatory is over 200 years old and has never had a South African director. There's someone that they like to claim was South African because they were naturalized, but it was a British-born person who moved to South Africa during apartheid to come be an astronomer. So I'm not going to count that person. So they're very happy to keep having this colonial institution run by foreigners, and South Africans are not being promoted up into these, despite applying and getting the training, which is never good enough. And that's what we talk about when we talk about the mindsets that need to change as well. So of course, then there is this urgent need to acknowledge and redress all of these issues, the previous failures. And there is, things are starting to change. There are now increasingly opportunities to work with and empower local and indigenous communities. So for instance, SKA in South Africa has put a lot of investment into local communities. There's a little graphic on the side where we talk about the amount of, it's in rands. So I know that's difficult to place, but I will put it in the context for you. So they've spent millions and millions and hundreds of millions of rands on local service providers and contractors and upskilling people in the communities. I will also just point out that the SKA is being built in the poorest province in the country. And so they're spending money on the local community and upskilling them so they can have an active role to play in the building the telescope and the upkeep of the telescope, and also educating young people so that they will become eventually, hopefully, end users of this telescope. And so there's a whole bunch of numbers there. And altogether, these aren't all the numbers, these are just some of the bigger ones, but altogether, the SKA spends about 20% of that province's GDP, total GDP, comes from SKA expenditure. So they're making a significant and meaningful and hopefully sustainable contribution to the economic freedoms of the people in this very, very poorest province. The next one, where you see a lot of, I think it's probably the most clear example of colonial attitudes and mindsets, is the education and public engagement that we do in astronomy. So it's still presented from a largely Western view of astronomy and science. I know the Greek names for constellations. I couldn't tell you one Xhosa name for constellation, or one Sotho name, or one Zulu name, because I wasn't ever taught that. And what's bizarre about things like this when it comes to the education and public engagement, when it comes to textbooks, you open a textbook, an astronomy textbook in South Africa or Australia or Brazil, and it doesn't reflect the lived reality of the people at these different latitudes, because here's an example. This image here on the right shows you how to locate Polaris, the North Star, and the Big Dipper, and how to navigate and find north. You can't see that in the Southern Hemisphere. And it looks completely, if you can see it in Brazil, it looks completely different. Orion is upside down. In the Southern Hemisphere, he's doing a cartwheel, and his dog is also doing a cartwheel. So I look in this textbook and I look at the sky and they don't make sense. And then from that, you start to think, well, maybe astronomy is not for me because this textbook doesn't make sense to what I'm seeing with my own eyes. And these images are still in our textbooks, and we're trying to teach children and engage them and get young people interested in the science that just doesn't make sense in the world that they live in. And so, and even more so, indigenous and local knowledge systems and contributions that need to be uncovered and acknowledged and incorporated into our teaching materials and our outreach materials at all levels. A big part of the reason that we don't have as much information or it's not as easy to get at the indigenous knowledge systems and the information that has been built up over thousands of years by various indigenous peoples, is that before colonialism, before the appearance of Europeans in places like Africa and Australia and the Americas, most of the way that we convey information and keep stories alive and keep information going and circulating in the community is through speaking. There's very little writing. And so when colonists came and they prevented us, for instance, from speaking our language, that was a very, very powerful way to break the connection between our history and our hard-learned knowledge that we had built up over the millennia, because all of a sudden everyone had to speak some European language, and those languages were left for dead, and in some cases died out completely. And the breadth and depth of the knowledge that had been built up across centuries died with that language. And so that's another very tragic and concrete example of how indigenous ways of knowing were destroyed and silenced in a very real way. So within the science community, if you've been to any of my talks before, you will have seen this image here on the right. That's a poster that says, "The system isn't broken, it was built this way." And this slide appears in my EDI talk as well, where we talk about science academia and academia in general is still largely based on the 17th century European Enlightenment period and social structures from there. And current the social structure at the time was basically for men who didn't need to work, so rich men who had leisure to study and invent calculus and experiment with chemicals and put pins in their eye. I love bringing up that example of Newton putting a pin through his eyeball for science. And so obviously, if you were a carer of anyone, if you had family responsibilities, if you're religious, because in the old days you could absolutely be a priest and be a scientist, but now it's seen as some weird thing that you can't do anymore. If you have disability, if you come from a poor background, you will struggle to break into science academia. I myself am sitting here right now, a victim of unfair practices and struggling to make ends meet, because it turns out that only my research salary is benefits from the 30% tax break that you get as a highly skilled migrant, and my EDI salary does not benefit from that. So I make less than the average postdoc doing all this fun work for the community. So, and that's unsustainable, and it makes me feel like I am unappreciated and I want to leave. And that's the kind of thing that happens. It's this attrition, these small things, because, according to the old school 17th century social structures, only rich people are supposed to do this anyway. So if you aren't rich, then leave it to the rich people who can afford to just do science because they love it. Museum collections. Museum collections are another classic example. So most of the astronomy collections in science museums are very Eurocentric. And they do exist ethnographic museums in Europe, and they show artifacts from former colonies. And science museums show these, they show artifacts from former colonies, but they show them sort of in the European scientific context where it's like, oh, this was used in, you know, in South America 200 years ago, but it's stuff that the Spanish brought over. The actual instrumentation and knowledge, of course, that was used by the people, the local people and the indigenous people before European contact, don't necessarily end up in these big fancy science museums that a lot of people do go to. So this kind of perpetuates this colonial view on knowledge production, and it ignores the contributions and the meaning of local indigenous knowledge systems, and how how we specifically use astronomy, in terms of timekeeping, in terms of, as the Namibian ambassador said so beautifully, for those of you who didn't get to go on Friday to the EHT event, I met the Namibian ambassador, and she gave this beautiful speech where she said, not only did the indigenous people of Namibia use astronomy as a calendar, and as a timekeeping device, but also they looked to the stars in the sky for guidance, and what that meant in their local context, to guide them in their society and what to do. And in a lot of ways, and it might sound a little bit mythical, but ultimately, colonial powers also used the stars for guidance, to guide them around the globe so that they could, further their efforts of taking over the world. So one big aspect of colonization and colonial mindsets and power structures is resource extraction and resource exploitation. And so this is in a general sense where you have resources, and the resources for some reason are always in underdeveloped countries. So these underdeveloped countries, or another way to think of that is overexploited countries. Exploited countries have a lot of resources. Across Africa, there's just untold mineral wealth and all of these things, and then they get extracted and transported as raw materials, and they get manufactured and made into value-added products that then get sold and make more money for the country that doesn't have the mineral wealth, but does have the mechanism to exploit that. And so in the context of astronomy, one example is data processing. So the data acquisition happens where the telescopes are. That's where we catch the photons. So in the global south, as we like to call it, South Africa, Chile, Hawaii, places like that, that's where the telescopes are. And then the data gets shipped or transported somehow to the data processing centers and pipelines in the global north, usually Europe and the US. And that's where the value added products come from. So research communities, writing papers, and the prestige of your research institutes and universities. And there is no backward movement of that prestige and of that value add, or there hasn't been until very recently, where it's just starting to happen. So another critical part of things that are happening under the old school colonial umbrella is the treatment of people and staff, the treatment of employees in the community. So there's a classic example of the brain drain. I'm a living example of that. I was mostly educated in South Africa. I had an opportunity to go to the United Kingdom for my PhD, and then I went back to South Africa, and the enthusiasm and relief, I would say, with which I was embraced, because I came back immediately after my PhD. There were several other South Africans who were on the same scholarship with me. Some of them have never returned. And I'm nearly 10 years post-PhD. These people are more senior than me. They've never gone back to South Africa after they got that chance to leave. I was in the newspaper. I was being photographed. I was being interviewed because they were so thrilled that someone that they had invested in as the South African government And as the South African astronomy community had made their way back immediately to South Africa. And so it was a very, very big deal. Obviously, it didn't last. I left South Africa again in 2017, and then have not really been, I've not settled back. I've instead just continued to country hop. So this is a big problem. And then the other one is the large salary differences between international staff and local staff. And this is a problem that is not hidden, it's out in the open. And international organizations like ESO, the European Southern Observatories, they have big differences in salary scales for international staff and for local staff. So in Chile, I know, as many of us do, we know people on ESO fellowships that go there and they get paid enough money that they would be able to live in Europe comfortably, like in a capital city like Amsterdam, quite comfortably. And they get that money in Chile, where the cost of living is significantly lower. So they live in lavish, they have diplomatic visas or something, so their bags don't get checked, so they can smuggle cheese into the country. So they're breaking laws, and everyone knows, and everyone thinks it's hilarious. And they don't pay tax, so it's just, you can absolutely have a ball of a time in Chile if you have an ESO fellowship. Meanwhile, the local staff get paid like local people, and it's disrespectful. It's just such an egregious example of exploitation, and it's so disrespectful because everyone knows it's going on. Everyone's known for decades that it's been going on because it was set up like that, and it's still continuing to this day. And I have a lot of sympathy for the people who are in the situation, and we need to start thinking much more carefully about these kind of things, because this is again the kind of thing that would make someone say, why would I want to get involved with science? Because this is how they treat people. Only certain people can, afford to become scientists. And then a more hidden category is the financial aspects and where we get our money from, investment funding. So the source of funds in astronomy are related to investment, and you get from the government, so foundations, pension schemes, etc. And these, when you scratch below the surface of what that means, it comes from slavery, slave money. When you turned up in Africa and decided that we weren't people and that we were things, and forced us to enrich your country, you still reap the benefits now, and I can't get a visa to go to conferences, which is part of my job. Oil is also, of course, another thing that turned out to be bad. It's very lucrative, but it's turning out it's going to destroy the planet if we continue like this. So a lot of this is hidden on purpose. So it's difficult to get good information about where the money comes from. It's oil money, it's tobacco money, it's money related to slavery, and other fossil fuels and so on. And it's and possibly also shady military practices, for example. So the image here on the right is a screenshot of the front page of a newspaper that says Dutch companies struggle with slavery history. And they name some companies here, including my own bank in the Netherlands, and where their money came from and how they managed to, build up this, and tracing it back to the Caribbean slave trade and things like that. And again, this is the kind of thing where people can say, well, that was stuff that happened hundreds of years ago, and there's nothing. It's not my fault that I'm rich now because of that. But I feel that we can do better and do a bit more self-interrogation and a bit more interrogation within our community and at our universities and at our research institutions to really get to the heart of where does this money come from. So the last one is quite a big one, and it kind of also relates to the money. And it's worrying because the connections with the defense industry and the new space race, especially with these bored billionaires who are doing all their private launching of rockets and things, because that's very much, in the public eye right now. So this link between astronomy and space exploration and the military-industrial complex across the globe is one that I don't think a lot of people outside of science are aware of, how the two things are linked. and probably even a lot of astronomers aren't aware. And most of the companies that develop space technologies have a military branch or vice versa, and they have at least incredibly lucrative contracts with space agencies like ESA, the European Space Agency, or NASA. And despite the fact that ESA's purpose shall be to provide for and promote for exclusively peaceful purposes cooperation among European states in space research and technology and their space applications. So that's from the ESA website, that's their mandate, but that's not actually what's happening in practice. They do work alongside the military industrial complex, and there's a war in Europe right now, and we know what that means. When you work alongside the military, you're tacitly accepting the fact that you are working along people that are going to kill lots of people, and what that means and how that's hushed up. And you're encouraged to look past that, because the science, think about the science that we get out of it. Does the science that we get out of it justify links with the military industrial complex the way it is now? And then the colonization, the new age of colonization now, is to take it to the rest of this, make colonization not just Earth's problem, but make it the solar system's problem. And this links to the board billionaires I mentioned just earlier on this. The thing that's worrying about this new form of colonization of Mars and the moon is the narratives and the frameworks and the mindset of space exploration. They use the same words that the old school colonizers used. This idea that Mars is empty and the moon is empty, the phrase terra nullius. If you are Australian, you're familiar with that, and that for some reason is particularly unpleasant to me. This idea that you turn up in a place, you look around and you see people, you see things, and you decide, no, that's not important, it's empty and it's mine now. And and we're absolutely trying to do that to the moon, and we're trying to do that to Mars as well. And so far we haven't found anything on the moon, and we haven't found anything on Mars. But does that make it okay for us to decide it's ours now? After what we've, well, not after, we are currently destroying our own planet. Is it responsible of us to then go without having learned any lessons and facing no real consequences for the destruction we've wrought here, to go and make that some other planetary body's problem? So I've attended this fantastic Space Science in Context conference that really works to push against this narrative, this old school colonial narrative of discoveries and new worlds and etc. And also just the way we're trying to sanitize this. So here's, again, from the ESA website, an article where there are Europeans, once explorers, always explorers. So now it's explorers. So now colonialism is about exploring. It's not about slavery. It's not about subjugation. It's not about dehumanizing people that were living perfectly fine without you. Now it's just, it was just a passion for exploration. And we are trying to do the same thing now, but in space. And I just don't think as a species, as Homo sapiens, we have had enough of a conversation and enough of a think about how we're treating our planet for us to be so confident to want to take this out into space and essentially export our problems to other worlds. So the question in now, I guess, after I've given you examples, I've given you definitions, now we ask another question. What would decolonized astronomy actually look like? Because it's a heavy question. And a lot of the pushback that you get when you have these social justice conversations is, well, it's got us this far. Why do you want to change it now? And then the question then for back at that is, it's worked so far for certain people, but it's obviously not working for everyone. So, but it's so entrenched, and we've been doing it for so long that it's very difficult to take a step and think outside the box, like what would this actually look like if it was completely different? So trying to conceptualize that, so starting with moving away from the Western-centric structures within astronomy and the community, and move away from perpetuating colonial ideals and mindsets. And that can be as simple as changing the way we speak. Instead of talking about colonizing Mars or settlers on Mars or colonies on the moon, change the language structure. And then that will start to help you change your mindset and hopefully be able to conceive of a decolonized science community and science in practice as well. Another step would be to acknowledge and bring indigenous knowledge systems onto the same footing as astronomy's Western heritage. And that gets a massive amount of pushback. I debated whether I should include some tweets, some very disrespectful and actually quite harmful tweets from Richard Dawkins, who is against this kind of thing. He's very outspoken against religion and very outspoken against indigenous knowledge systems, because to him, the only kind of science is the kind of science that came about in Europe from the 17th century, and everything else is worthless and useless and wrong and bad. And this is, again, this comes from the fact that this is a very narrow worldview, and it's very difficult to think your way out of this, especially if the only people that you interact with are people who have the same mindsets as you do. And it comes kind of to the third point, where astronomy is a global endeavor, science is a global endeavor, and just because you can't conceptualize a world that doesn't center you does not mean that that is the only, that having you at the center is the only way to conduct science. So the global astronomy community at all levels should aim to be as diverse as society outside of academia. And that's the only real way that you can move forward and make astronomy reflect society at large and make the science that we do accessible and relevant to everyone, because we're fighting misinformation at all levels as scientists. And with the pandemic, it has shown that the misinformation will win, because the people behind it are very good at talking to people on their level and getting them to buy into lies, unfortunately. And we're not that good at it yet, because we're in these silos where our understanding of how science should be communicated doesn't work for everywhere in the world, and it's literally killing people. And we need to take a step back, try and reconceptualize this, and start with small things like having these conversations, coming to these talks, changing the language that we use, and starting to make a strenuous and concerted effort to go and delve into indigenous knowledge systems and see, how that changes your perspective of the world and of the people in it. So I want to give you a practical example of what decolonized science could look like. So a while ago, I cropped it out. This is a screenshot on the left here from the Royal Institute, from their Twitter feed. And a while ago, it was apparently National Gin and Tonic Day or something. And so they decided to delve into what's in a gin and tonic for science reasons. So tonic water, it says in the tweet, contains quinine, which for centuries has been used to treat malaria. And then there's a little emoji of a cocktail. And then there's a thread that goes on, but I'll just address this first thing where they say, an only slightly boozy thread about malaria and the fight to treat it. So they're trying to do psychom, they're trying to link it to, everyday people. But again, in academia, we have this thing, in science academia especially, we have this thing around socializing around drinking. And this is really focusing on booze and stuff. But you can imagine automatically, if you're Muslim, this isn't something you necessarily want to engage with, or if you, for whatever reason, don't have a good relationship or casual relationship with alcohol, you might not want to. So you're missing out now. So they've excluded big demographics of people who don't want to engage with alcohol, even on their social media. And so this is the kind of rethinking that needs to happen. And actually, hopefully my screen is my screen still sharing? Is it sharing Twitter? Can someone let me know?
Yes, it is. Yes,
sorry?
You're sharing the presentation right now.
So not the tweet?
No.
Okay, that's fine. So I was hoping that I could, but then Professor David K. Smith from the University of York decolonized, quote unquote, this thread where they talk about the discovery of quinine and the tree that it's from, and how the British would give tonic water and gin and tonic to their soldiers in Asia, so that they could be fit and not succumb to malaria. And so the decolonized version of this is basically going through the fact that how the discovery was made, the fact that before Europeans discovered the medicinal properties of this plant, the indigenous people of South America that the plant is from had been using it for centuries. They had figured this out before, and they were using it to protect themselves against the scourge of malaria. None of that is recognized in a lot of the scientific writing around quinine, certainly not in the Royal Institute's Twitter thread. He then also goes on to point out that when they talk about the British military, giving this medicinal tonic to the employees, to the soldiers, the reason why they needed that is, as you can imagine, there's not a lot of malaria naturally in the UK. It's just not warm enough. So these were occupying forces. So they were giving malaria medication to people for instance, in India, so that they could be fit and healthy to further suppress the Indian population, and continue to subjugate India and make it be a colony. And also they weren't giving this medication or these tonics to the Indian people. It was only for the British people. The Indian people were left to their own devices to be harmed by malaria. They also neglect to mention that one of the first people to sort of synthesize the active ingredient in quinine out of the plant was an East Asian chemist who went on to win a Nobel Prize. So they decided to just gloss over a Nobel Prize winning scientist who worked with the same compound and chemical and actually managed to isolate it and synthesize it so you don't have to keep using this plant anymore. And then lastly, Professor David Smith talks about how, despite the fact that that European colonizing powers were using this, this medicinal tonic to keep themselves healthy, they withheld a lot of medication and help from Africans, for instance, and Africa bears the brunt of the burden of malarial deaths, especially for children under the age of 10 years old. So it's really tragic that there was the scientific knowledge. It had been proven to be useful, it had been proven to be effective and safe, and that knowledge was not disseminated and it was not shared, and people were allowed to die. And so this is the kind of more holistic and global look at something as simple as a gin and tonic and the ingredients in it and why we drink it and why it was encouraged to be drunk, but who had access to it, who knew what they knew and chose not to share it, and what the ramifications centuries, decades later, that is still having right now across the global South. So again, when this is shared around, you can click on the links here and go through the tweets yourself and familiarize yourself with really juxtapose the sort of official line from the Royal Institute that was trying to do a fun bit of science communication, and then a more broader global decolonized version of the same. You get the same science information, but you also get an insight into how science academia and science culture works when it comes to sharing useful information and saving people's lives. Another example of this was last November. I attempted to go home for Christmas to see my family after 2 years during the pandemic, and 48 hours before I was due to fly home, South African scientists announced a new variant of concern, the Omicron variant, that then swept through Europe during the winter. And so the South African virology community and epidemiology community is extremely advanced because we have had to build up this infrastructure due to our massive problem with HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis. So we have very, very good early detection protocols in place. And once the South Africans and scientists in Botswana identified what is now known as the Omicron strain or variant of coronavirus, they did what you're supposed to do. The protocol is you make the discovery and you inform the World Health Organization and other countries so that they can protect themselves. And then instead of saying, thank you, South Africa and Botswana, you saved so many lives probably, they decided, or the European, or the global North countries decided that South Africa and Botswana and other African countries should be punished and put us on a no-fly red list. And so I was not able to go home to South Africa because I wasn't sure whether once in South Africa, I would be able to return to the Netherlands to start my job. And so this is another example of this idea that when, you know, when certain people have information, it's weaponized against them, but to the detriment of many. And this idea, or that it's not trusted, because there was also this idea that, you know, can we really trust these Africans? What do they know about science? Why, you know, this should really be coming from the CDC or from the WHO or from established countries. And so this is another example of the colonized mindset and how it's perpetuated through scientists and through the science community to the detriment of millions of people around the world. So I think that's my last slide, some real world examples. And we definitely have time for, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We definitely have time for a bit of discussion and questions. So I look forward to that.
Well, thank you very, very much, Tana, for that really interesting talk. Let's begin with an applause for Tana. Thank you very much. And yeah, who may I give the floor?
There's 3 questions in the chat, possibly.
No, there's those are comments of people. Filippo.
Yeah, hi, I'm Filippo Marcagni from Aston. Sorry, I forgot to put the last name. No, very, very interesting talk. I just had one thing to add. I agree there is always a big difference from the culture, and therefore astronomy should be more englobating. So to consider also the culture of the minorities around the world. But when you go to talk about religion and saying, because you mentioned that you say that still academia and religion are not mixed because we are Western, I would like to point out that the religion, there are historical reasons for this. And you can start thinking about this from Galileo. And therefore, it's important to consider, for example, all the native knowledge that is often connected to religion. But it's also important to think what we want to do as astronomy. One thing is the culture, the general culture, one thing is the implementation of science. And we cannot encounter the risk of having the Inquisition again, of having this kind of forms. So this would have been my thing, that we always have to take the broad worldwide picture. It's not an opposition between the colonizers of the past and the native people. Yeah, and that's one thing.
Okay, so
and the other point I wanted to make is that the 30% rule, Dutch postdocs do not get it. So I mean, it's not very nice to complain about salary when there are people certainly paid less than you.
Okay, first of all, I'm allowed to complain about my salary if I want to. I do feel that I am.
I'm just saying that it's not
very polite.
I said it's not very polite.
Filippo,
you can do whatever you want.
Filippo,
it's not polite. It's true.
Filippo, stop. Sorry. Please
clearly have a chip on your shoulder, and that's fine. I obviously do too. I am very intrigued by your use of the word minorities. In astronomy, this idea that people outside of Europe are minorities because white people are minority on this planet. So there's another example of words being used in a certain way. Like, what do you mean by minorities?
Well, native populations are demographically minorities everywhere in the world.
Indigenous populations?
Native populations, yes.
What do you mean by native population? So no,
indigenous
you don't have to answer, but I'm just saying the words that you're using are very
yes, because you know I am not a native speaker, so you should also no, because you are very aggressive.
Oh, now I'm aggressive. Okay,
I was not aggressive in my question. So first of all, you should consider that I'm not a native speaker. First of all, so I'm sorry if I used the different word. Then I will make a presentation. I will point out indigenous, native, like the examples that you made about the Aboriginal people, the Maori people, all these are demographically minorities worldwide. Do we agree on this?
Yes, but they are not the only indigenous people that exist.
Yes, I agree, but I just told you that I used the wrong word. I wanted to say native. We make this
Okay,
point.
fine.
I'm sorry.
Okay, fine.
Thank you also to
Fine.
point out in aggressive way. And I also gave you the motivation of why I made the mistake. I'm sorry I made this mistake.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the fact that you're calling me aggressive. That's very cute. So the other point
I'm sorry you don't
made
understand
was-
this is an aggressive
No,
way
that
of
was
talking,
that
but
was
it's your
sarcastic.
problem.
Sorry,
That
but
was
I now.
sarcastic. So the other issue that you had was this tension allegedly between religion and science, and not wanting to go backwards. I would also point out that this is a particularly Western issue, and that in Africa it is very normal to be very religious and to be a good scientist. And so again, it's a different kind of culture and a different kind of mindset, and we don't see that tension the way it's discussed in Europe and in the US, for instance. So this idea that, of course, everyone agrees that science and religion mustn't overlap is not as widespread as you to think, and is absolutely not representative of the global community. And there are enough people that don't have that tension for us to be able to take a step back and think, well, why is that the case? What kind of, because you're also trying to separate science from cultural values. And again, that is not how the lived reality. When you bring the culture you were raised in and all those kind of values that you have, you absolutely bring that into your work as a scientist. Scientists aren't robots, they're not perfect data collection machines and paper writing machines. You bring your whole self, whether you want to or not, into your work, and that includes biases and cultural differences as well. And again, I don't appreciate being told that it's not polite to talk about the fact that I don't get paid as much as some people because other people have it worse. That is exactly the kind of thing that allows injustice to be perpetuated, because we're all trying to be polite instead of trying to be honest.
Okay, so I mean,
let's maybe.
Okay, just one thing I have to reply, because about the religion point, I just want to say that we have to make a global analysis in which all opinions are the same. So the fact that you tell me that in South Africa, not in the continent of Africa, you have a different view is great, and we should put all the views
Africa,
together.
I didn't say
we
South
should put
Africa.
all the views together, but
I said Africa, so across the continent.
Because in North Africa the things are completely culturally different and also religiously different.
Yeah, so I didn't say the religion was the same.
I cannot believe what you're
I
saying,
said
and I think you're wrong.
Sorry, I'm now.
If you don't bring the references, I will think that you're wrong. So I'm sorry, but if you say these things, I think that you should also motivate them with further references. That's it.
Filippo, sorry.
There are references in my talk.
I'm the chair, and I find that discussion is now getting too acrimonious, so I'm ending it. And I'm going to the next topic. So, Bas, you have your hands up?
Hey, oh, yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. All
right. So I guess switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask about the SKA project that you brought up earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So it is clear that this particular project is one example of where the location where it is being built is taken into account and the effect of that on the local community. And I wonder if you perhaps know more about why was this project approached differently? And also if this maybe is just the start of more future examples, or if, let's say, if this is the start of a trend, perhaps, or not necessarily, and maybe what it depends on.
So I think that, because I also want to point out that SK is obviously also in Australia, and in Australia they are also working very hard to, for instance, just like they did in South Africa, have land acknowledgements for the indigenous people's land that they're on and this kind of thing. And this is the result, I think, both in South Africa and Australia, it's the result of a lot of work by the indigenous and local people themselves to make themselves heard and to raise these issues and to raise awareness of these problems so that we don't perpetuate them. South Africa is kind of unique because we have a very recent, in my lifetime, history of an oppressive, racially based regime. I was born during the apartheid regime of South Africa, so it's very, very recent. And with that in mind, our government was, it's not often I get to say nice things about the South African government, but they were very careful to, when they did their bid for getting the SKA, as the other countries also did, they were very careful to make the accessibility and the social justice and the equity and all of that front and center of their bid for the SKA. So it was built in from the start that they were going to be like, okay, we're going to build this thing, but here's how it's actually going to make South Africa better. Here's how it's going to make other African countries better when we partner with them. And, you know, how we're going to use this cutting edge science and technology to enrich people's lives in a meaningful way and, you know, give numbers and, you know, this is the money that we're going to spend. And so it was a deliberate effort based on a lot of hard work and a lot of lessons learned. And the second sort of part of what you were saying was that well, is this, you know, a sign of the times? Will things get better? That remains to be seen because, for instance, what's happening in Hawaii is still very unresolved. We're trying to do better with SKA in the Southern Hemisphere, but in Hawaii, there seems to be, they're kind of at a deadlock now between trying to make things better and keeping things the same, or running the same kind of process in the same kind of way. And so, yeah, so we would like to think optimistically that this is a sign that things are changing, but it's not necessarily the case. It might be a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think it's just another kind of wake up call for us to know that just because some people are doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing or doing their best to do the right thing, that doesn't mean we stop the push, we stop raising awareness and stop talking about it, because it looks like things are going to be okay if we just let them go on as is. And I don't know if there was another part to your question. I know there were 2 parts. Did I miss anything out?
No, let's move on to the next question. Thanks.
Okay, Leo.
Yeah, hi Tana. Thanks a lot for the talk. I was particularly intrigued by your mentioning the intersection between decolonization and climate justice. As you know, there's already a lot happening in terms of climate justice, the sustainability movement in astronomy. But I was wondering if you had any specific suggestions for exploring and perhaps strengthening this link. So how could we make sure that we take into account the decolonization aspect in our sustainability efforts as well?
So that's a very good question, because these things are very interlinked. Climate justice and social justice are the same kind of thing, because the people who are most vulnerable to climate change and the fallout of climate change are people in overexploited / underdeveloped countries. So one of the things would obviously be that came out of the pandemic would be to continue to have virtual conferences or hybrid conferences. And this summer, I was very disappointed to find out that, for instance, the European Astronomical Society conference that started out hybrid, quietly they dropped the virtual part, and they're basically forcing people now to commute to Valencia. And so the NAEIC committee that I am part of, and that that is organizing this seminar series, we have some guidelines that Ralph has had a big hand in putting together about fee structures around this, and about basically how to, at least on the very small scale of running conferences, astronomy conferences around the world, so having virtual options, other things like having meetings in places where they normally aren't. So in 2024, so 2 years from now, the International Astronomical Union's General Assembly will be in Africa for the first time in Cape Town. And so that's another way to, it's going to ensure that people who normally don't have the funding to be able to travel to Asia or Europe or the US, or even South America, get to experience an IAUGA in their backyard, and that's very useful. So it's useful from the accessibility point of view as well, because a lot of the suggestions that go around climate justice things actually also link with geographical accessibility as well. So we need to maybe keep some of the stuff that we learned in during the pandemic. And people are now starting to publish data that they gathered over the past 2.5, nearly 3 years now, of having these hybrid conferences or virtual only conferences, and how that has improved the attendance of traditionally excluded and marginalized people in our community, and how it's opening that up to people who didn't normally have that. So something as small as virtual options for conferences is a big step.
Yeah.
And having guidelines around, like, I know at my institution, we have guidelines. So if your trip can be done under a certain number of hours by train, then, you should only be able to book a train journey and things like that. And of course, when we think about the major installations that we're trying to build, how to make them more sustainable, how to make them more environmentally friendly, and having less of a negative impact. Excuse me. So that's something for the people who are building our installations, building our experiments, building our telescopes. How do we make them have the least amount of negative impact on society and on our planet? And even going back to the funding thing that we talked about, where we're investing our money, where our funding comes from, and interacting in terms of investments and investing money in things like coal and oil and those kind of fossil fuels. If that's a big money spinner for us, we need to maybe start thinking about moving that around and changing that so that we don't prop up those industries that we know now are so harmful to our planet. So there's like large scale, top down, massive policy shifts that need to happen at a national level. And then also small things like local organizing committees of meetings, having Zoom links, basically.
Yeah. Lots of good points. I particularly agree about the online component. And let me just add that we have actually complained as both the sustainability committee, and I see that Jake is also online as the inclusion committee as well, of the EAS, against the EAS deciding to not offer remote access to this year's meeting, and not even to the General Assembly. So even if you're just a member of the society, you cannot come to the assembly if you don't have the abilities to travel
Absolutely.
to Valencia, which many people don't. So fully agree.
Good.
Yeah, thanks.
And thank you for raising these concerns with the relevant organizing committees, because the more people who chime in, the less easy it is to ignore us.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, Ilse.
Yep. Thanks, Tana. I'm sorry I dropped into your talk about halfway through because I had sound problems and I couldn't hear what you were saying. So I'm sorry if this is asking something you discussed before. We already noticed this is a topic that raises a lot of emotional responses, and some of the things that you mentioned about the money and the money flows. When you look at, for example, the situation in the Netherlands, there's really no way around it. Our wealth is built on slavery and slave trade. So in essence, everything we spend here is slave money at the moment, and it will be for many centuries to come, if you look at it that way. So what people may start to think, so what can we change here if it's all slave money, if we are never going to get this right, because we can't right these wrongs anymore, they were centuries ago. Why should we even start trying, even if it's never going to be the right way? And this is a discussion that has also been going on in my head, and I really don't have the answer. So I'd be interested to hear from you, where can we start? What are the hooks that we have to get into the discussion with people who are comfortably sitting in leadership positions, that we can actually start discussing this and making real changes, and really start to take decolonization into account in policy making for future steps?
So a lot of what these, my thoughts around this, and I'm sure you have this a similar line of thinking, is it's obviously bigger than astronomy. But how do we as astronomers start applying pressure? So last Friday, as I mentioned, we were at a celebration, and present there were was the Namibian ambassador to the EU, as well as the Dutch science minister. So we do have, we're very fortunate as scientists, or as astronomers maybe in particular, that we do have sometimes these opportunities where we can start talking to these people face to face. And of course, at a party, you're not going to sit down and, you know, give them a lecture for an hour, but just start building those links and getting a business card and, you know, dropping an email and start building up the rapport between you and people who actually have the power to change things. In terms of redistribution of resources, whether it's money or whatever, I think that, I mean, there are, for instance, in the US, there's a lot of talk around this, and a lot more, they are a lot further along in their discussions around this, and in their, you know, their frameworks, and thinking about what would be a good way to distribute, for instance, money. And that scares a lot of people, because a lot of people, many, like you said, wealthy and therefore powerful people, have a lot invested in keeping things the way they are. So I would, in the first instance, recommend that we start looking and seeing what the people in the US across the pond, and especially at grassroots levels and grassroots organizations. So not necessarily listening to their politicians, but listening to the people on the ground who have a lot of expertise in this, and hearing what they have to say, and seeing how not all of it will be, of course, applicable to our current situation and our local situation, but some of the broader strokes things might be. And so going back to the very first question that was so contentious about salary, one of the obvious and easy ways to change things is to make sure that you're paying the local people the same as the international people. That's a classic one to do, and is controllable by an organization, rather than needing to necessarily involve, you know, the science minister or the finance minister in that. So it depends on, so it kind of depends on what level we want to start approaching the change from. And there's absolutely, and I think it should be all of the levels, but we need to think about, you know, like, what can you personally do, or what can your committee do, and who can they recommend to, and how to take that up the chain.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from the YouTube stream. I'm going to try and read it from Sadel Morabit. Basically, if you look at the specific case of Hawaii, a dilemma is posed, namely, should you do that discussion and interaction about, you know, what is and is not permissible directly with the local community or with the nation's government? And of course, the dilemma being the government may be more likely to be, say, under lobbying influence or somehow not representative. On the other hand, such a thing as the local community also doesn't exist. It usually also exists of many voices that may have different opinions on the issue. So what would be a constructive and productive or fair way of having that discussion? Right? In a democracy, we're used to the idea that somehow you elect representatives, and once you have elected them, you live with them, even if you dislike them. And so how do you get that process to go, so to speak?
So I will start by saying that in the specific case of Hawaii, the government is in the US government, because Hawaii is a state of the US. The government itself is an occupying force. Hawaii was a sovereign nation with a monarchy and stuff, and the US came in, deposed their monarchy and made it a state. So that happened only mere decades ago. This wasn't hundreds of years ago, like South Africa. This was recent in some of your lifetimes. So talking to the colonizing and the occupying force is probably you're not going to get very far, because obviously they want to keep Hawaii under occupation. And so listening to the local people, again, that brings into play this thing about language, the difference between indigenous and local, and what that means. At the moment, the talks, as I said, they seem to be deadlocked, but I think that the people to listen to here are the people who know a lot more about this, who are in the community, or at least, at the very least, in the US. And again, there are links to some reading that you can start doing in the talk that I gave, which will be on the website. So click on the links and start there. Start by reading various opinions of people who are in the astronomy community, but also in the local community. That's always a very good place to start. It is a very complicated and nuanced discussion, and I absolutely do not claim to know enough about it to be able to really unpack all of that there, except to say that the US government absolutely has their own reasons for wanting to keep things the way they are, and increasing calls from the indigenous community, I think spurred on in large part by the focus that there was on Hawaii because of the TMT, because it did capture the global imagination. There are now louder and louder calls for Hawaii to again become its own independent nation state.
Yeah, thank you. So Karsten has a question.
I was interested in the connection that you made, Tana, about the language that was used to basically create colonies on Earth, and then of course colonization, as it's being talked about on Mars and maybe other planets. I think that is really interesting. On the other hand, I think we do have somewhat of an advantage because there are already discussions going on about the ethics of what you can do with another planet. I think in the 15 and 1600s, when the colonization really got to full swing, I think nobody was really discussing any ethical implications of that. And now I think it's different. So there are specific agencies which look at in what way we need to be careful with places like Antarctica, and then by extension with places like other planets. So do you think that this is a useful starting point for this kind of discussion, or do you think it's all going to be so weak and once Elon Musk gets to Mars, he's going to do whatever he wants anyway?
I think the answer to both those questions is yes. Yes, it is absolutely useful and necessary to have these conversations so that we need to learn from our mistakes and take a Bayesian approach. We've done something. Now we have more information, and now we apply it, and we'll probably hopefully get a different outcome. But at the same time, with the current way that things are progressing, Elon Musk or Richard Branson or Jeff Bezos is going to get there and do what they want, because they have enough wealth that even governments cower before them. And the fact that they are people are allowed to accumulate so much wealth is a hallmark of a society that is based on old mindsets that are outdated, and this is the natural end point of that kind of thinking of conquer at all costs. So whether we can, as a society, work together to try and prevent that a second wave of that same kind of issues remains to be seen. There's definitely no political will at the very top. We know that, because those people are just too rich.
Yeah, as the quip goes, if those people want to go to where they have never been before, you could send them to the tax office. It's so. I mean, a question for you that harks back to the previous discussion, and I don't want to restart any acrimony, but still try to approach this in another way. I suppose some of the sensitivity about accepting other ways of knowing and what belongs to science and what belongs not is that science, where we have it here, has emerged from lots of things that we knew, and in the end we decided based on data that some of those things we knew were actually not true and some of things were. And so I guess the tricky part there is that as you become more independent, more open-minded, and you incorporate other ways of knowing, I suppose that in the end, the process of science will still in part be that you are selective, that you develop certain systems of knowledge, and that based on data, you come in the end to the conclusion that some things are true and sometimes some things are not. And so, I mean, am I seeing that right? Is that the tricky part of the dialogue? That yes, you can incorporate other systems of knowing, but even within those, you might have to conclude that they are not, as we concluded in our own old systems of knowing, that some of those things were worth remembering and some things were not.
Yeah, absolutely. The problem that we have at the moment is there's just so much stuff that's outright being ignored. And by saying, incorporating indigenous ways of knowing into our typical and standard education practices and science practices, that does give us an opportunity then to go and interrogate interrogate things that come out of indigenous ways of knowing. Because the problem with the indigenous knowledge systems is, like I said, they were cut short. They were, there came a point where they were just completely subjugated. And so the natural course of things of refining that and changing that, because I think there's this misunderstanding of indigenous knowledge systems as a static thing, like a thing that happened, like that there's not further inquiry and further curiosity. And by ending it at a certain point, that was all it was ever going to be. So by reviving those knowledge systems and bringing them to the fore again, we can then, there's nothing saying we can't query and we can't test and experiment and try and see which claims fit into reality and which claims don't. So we need to have an understanding of these systems as living things that obviously do also get updated and do change. So just because you had, there was a way of understanding the universe 5,000 years ago, and then 400 years ago, and obviously, in the intervening millennia, things changed. And then a few centuries ago, that inquiry and the way to explore that was cut short. That doesn't mean that that's where they stop.
Yeah, that's fair. Thanks. Ilse.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this discussion, especially about indigenous knowledge, for a couple of months when I saw a discussion on Twitter about this. And what Tana says is definitely a big issue. But another thing is that we forget that the indigenous knowledge was also found out by trial and error. If you navigated the wrong way in the Pacific Ocean, you would not survive. If you eat a poisonous fruit, you're dead. And so this knowledge is built up by years and years of testing and experimenting, but they just never wrote it down. And if that is the only difference, then we need to find another way to revive this knowledge and indeed bring it back to how we are now structuring knowledge and agree on a sort of common basis how we can integrate these different ways of thinking. But in the end, it all comes down to experimenting, right?
Sure. I mean, yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I mean, I don't think I meant to suggest that other ways, indigenous knowledge systems are somehow static and there's nothing of value in them. It's just that we know from our own local experience that in some sense, at some point there was a divide where, those more rigorous forms of, interrogating what people had always been thinking came into being, and some things survived that process and some things did not, right? So, I mean, I think some of the acrimony comes from people somehow having the impression that incorporating other ways of knowing would mean simply uncritically accepting everything that's in there. And I think nobody is advocating that, right?
But there's a gray area there, right?
Yeah, and I think that is a misconception that a lot of people have. I think you're right there, Ralph.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, of course, that no matter, even we as trained scientists always have to count to 10 and swallow when somebody tells us we are wrong about something. It's never very easy to accept being told you're wrong, right? And that's, I
think that is a major problem in this discussion.
Yeah, but that's and I think that's an affliction we all have. And I guess we are as emotional about that as non-scientists are. We have just been trained that you generally look like a fool to your colleagues if you do that all too obviously, so you typically swallow it, but still you don't like it. We all prefer to be right?
So another way to start getting around these issues of how to think about science and what is and isn't science and all that is to perhaps change change the way we teach science, but also start incorporating contributions from the social sciences. So like have a philosophy of science course that's a requirement for at the undergraduate level or something like that, because there is a lot to learn from the social scientists as well, for us as scientists, to help us figure out, how does science fit into society? And they are experts in our universities just on the other side of campus that can help us with that. And if we unsilo ourselves and let them in, I'm sure there's a lot that we can learn as well from the humanities on all of these kind of social justice issues that we're trying to grapple with now as scientists. Because at the end of the day, we all have PhDs in counting photons or looking at space gas, and it's but our on the other side of the university, there are people whose whole job it is to interrogate the world that we live in a completely different way to which we do it, but that we can absolutely also learn from.
Yeah, one of the frustrating things about our wonderful universities is that they are not countries, they are archipelagos, right? There are lots of subject fields which are very often separated by fairly deep seas that people don't typically swim across. We're kind of having to wrap up because we're getting closer. I'm seeing more and more messages that people unfortunately had to leave. We haven't heard from Harish yet. So Harish, may I give you the last question?
Thanks, Ralph. It's kind of my comment or question is similar to what we're talking of right now. And one of the things which is kind of clear in the material we have about, let's say, ancient European science is, in some sense, the wheat has been separated from the chaff, like in the sense that, scientifically speaking, like in Newton's theories, right? I mean, we don't really take scientifically seriously his things about alchemy or the temple in Israel or whatever that is. But although it might have a lot of cultural value, scientifically, in terms of objective truth, we know that that's not true. And something similar probably exists in other places too. I mean, I know about Indian astronomy, where astrology obviously is not true. It might have cultural value, but there are many other things which were worked out in ancient India, which is true. And so maybe we need some good resources or commentaries on these ancient texts or ways of knowing or whatever we're talking. And so I was just curious if people have, either Tana or others have, some kind of reading material where there's a good commentary written on this, where the things of cultural value are separated from things which are objectively true.
So I don't have off the top of my head reading list, but I know people who work on it. And one of them is, we've just confirmed as a speaker. Ralph, I don't know if we're allowed to tease this.
Sure. I mean,
Professor Jarita Holbrook, who will be a speaker in the upcoming months in the seminar series. She does a lot of work on cultural astronomy. And so if you attend her talk, she'll be able to direct you much better than I can, because that's a big part of, she's also a trained scientist, but does a lot more in-depth work and writing papers and stuff on cultural astronomy, specifically in Africa, but of course she'll know about people around the world who are working on this. And I don't know if you're on social media, but there are quite a few, there's quite a big push to do this kind of work in Australia with Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders. They have their own very active community, and they're very active on social media, especially on Twitter and Facebook. So if you search around there, you'll definitely find a whole host of resources that you can go and read up. There's this one called Deadly Science that's doing a lot of great work in the Indigenous Aboriginal communities in Australia. And they have a lot of materials and stuff that you can read up on and familiarize yourself with. So look out for that upcoming talk where we'll have an actual expert specifically on that coming in as well.
All right, thanks.
I have some vague memory from the Vienna IAUGA that there is even either an IAU working group or at least a small number of people in the IAU who are somewhat active in collecting that kind of data.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I guess one of the sad things that is that, like with languages of indigenous people, is that in some cases we have pushed the situation to a point where the knowledge may indeed simply have gone lost or is very difficult to recover, because nobody who used to have that knowledge is alive anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like some of this can make like really good teaching material, like trying to figure out, let's say, the diameter of the Earth, or something like that based on something that was done, I don't know, 2000 years ago. Like that's kind of a fun thing to do in a classroom.
Yeah, and again, you have to be very careful that you don't bias that towards the things you know. I mean, if I may make a small and somewhat provincial recommendation, among all the things there are, Anton Pannekoek's History of Astronomy, even though it is quite Western focused, it at least it digs back to Babylonia and the Arab world and many other places. So to the extent that he was aware of written sources on things, he gives a fairly extensive description of how at least the cultures in the Middle East came in different ways to finding out about the regularities of the celestial bodies. And even though that's a very incomplete picture, it still gives you already an idea that in different places, the same knowledge can come up in different ways, and it gets described very differently, but the net result is about the same.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think it's time to go. I would like to thank everybody very much, but especially I would like to thank Tana for her excellent talk and for her answering of so many questions. Thank you very much, Tana.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, thank you for the questions and the interaction. And I look forward to seeing what we as a community will do moving forward.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.